Welcome to Truth Behind History, the channel where we dig deep into the past to uncover the stories, ideologies, and decisions that shape the world we live in today. In this video, we're diving into a massive topic: the economic transformation of China under Mao Zedong. Now, if you've ever wondered how a rural, agrarian society became a communist state seemingly overnight, or how economic theories were applied in ways that reshaped millions of lives, and sometimes ended them, then this is the video for you. Stick with me, because what we're about to unpack is as fascinating as it is tragic, and trust me, the twists and turns of Maoist economics are anything but boring. Let's start with a bit of context. China in 1949. Imagine a country where nearly 85% of the population lived in the countryside, farming with tools and methods that hadn't changed much in centuries. We're talking about wooden plows, manual labor, and a near-complete absence of modern infrastructure. Roads were poor, electricity was scarce, and poverty was everywhere. It was a country still reeling from decades of internal strife, foreign invasion, and civil war. So, when the communists took power in 1949, the China they inherited was overwhelmingly agrarian, extremely poor, and in desperate need of transformation. Enter Mao Zedong. Mao had just led the Chinese Communist Party to a dramatic victory over the nationalists, establishing the People's Republic of China. But his ambitions went far beyond just political control. Mao wanted to radically reshape Chinese society, economically, culturally, ideologically. This wasn't just a change in government. It was the beginning of a new era with an entirely different vision of what China could be. And this brings us to the essence of Maoism. While Karl Marx emphasized the urban working class, the factory laborers at the heart of the Industrial Revolution, Mao looked elsewhere. China didn't have a strong urban proletariat. What it had was peasants. Millions of them. So Mao took Marxist theory and reinterpreted it through a distinctly Chinese lens. His revolution would be powered not by factory workers, but by the rural masses, the peasants. This peasant-centered approach became the defining feature of Maoist ideology and would go on to shape decades of policy. Alright, so now that we've got the historical backdrop, let's move into Maoist ideology and economic vision and see just how theory was turned into action. Let's go to the next slide. Now that we've set the stage, let's talk about Mao's unique brand of economic and ideological thinking, and let me tell you, it was nothing short of revolutionary. Literally. We begin with what I like to call the Great Role Reversal, the peasant vanguard. Unlike Marx, who envisioned the industrial working class as the engine of revolution, Mao looked at his own country and said, well, we don't have many factory workers, but we've got a whole lot of peasants. So, he flipped the script. He declared that the rural farmers, the ones planting rice, herding animals, and working the land, would be the new revolutionary heroes. This was a bold departure from orthodox Marxism and a direct response to China's overwhelmingly rural makeup. In Mao's eyes, the peasants weren't just victims of oppression, they were the solution. Next, we get into ideological supremacy, and this is where things get intense. For Mao, ideas weren't just important, they were everything. He believed that if the people truly embraced communist ideology, they could reshape the world through sheer willpower and collective action. Class struggle wasn't just a side effect of revolution, it was the fuel that kept it burning. Economic efficiency? That came second. What mattered most was loyalty to the revolution and the readiness to fight for its ideals. In Maoist China, mobilizing the masses around political campaigns was considered more valuable than carefully planned development. And all of this ties into his vision of utopia. Mao imagined a society that was self-reliant, classless, and unified in its effort to build socialism. He wanted to break China's dependence on foreign powers and leap into a future powered by the collective labor of the people. It was an idealistic dream of equality, simplicity, and unity, all centered around the rural village. But here's the catch: to build that utopia, Mao believed you had to tear down the old world first. And that's where things start to get messy. So now that we've got a handle on what Mao believed, let's look at what happened when he tried to make it a reality in one of the most dramatic and devastating campaigns in modern history. Let's move on to the Great Leap Forward. Alright, buckle up, because now we're diving into one of the most ambitious and catastrophic social experiments in modern history, the Great Leap Forward. Between 1958 and 1962, Mao launched a sweeping campaign aimed at transforming China from a rural agrarian society into a modern, industrialized communist utopia. And he wanted to do it fast, not over decades, but in just a few years. The slogan was simple: surpass Britain in steel production. The reality? Well, it was far more complicated. Let's start with people's communes. These were massive collective farms that merged thousands of households into single production units. Picture it, entire villages now working and living together, eating in communal kitchens, raising children in group nurseries, and reporting to party officials who oversaw every detail of daily life. The goal? To pool labor, centralize planning, and boost agricultural output through sheer scale. But the result was chaos. These communes often ignored local knowledge, disrupted traditional farming cycles, and led to widespread confusion and inefficiency. Then there were the infamous backyard furnaces. And I'm not joking here, and millions of villagers were instructed to melt down metal in makeshift furnaces built in their own backyards. Pots, pans, tools, even farm equipment were thrown in to create steel. The idea was to kickstart rural industry and match the West's production numbers. But most of this metal turned out to be completely useless, brittle, impure, and entirely non-functional. It was more about appearances than actual progress. Imagine melting down your only cooking pan to make steel you can't use. It was a tragic paradox. And then comes the human cost, the darkest part of the Great Leap Forward. With false reports of grain surpluses, the state took massive amounts of food from the countryside, leaving rural families to starve. Agricultural output collapsed under the weight of bad policy and forced collectivization. What followed was one of the deadliest famines in human history. An estimated 30 million people died. 30 million. That's nearly the population of Canada today, gone, not because of war or natural disaster, but because of economic mismanagement on a massive scale. The Great Leap Forward was supposed to catapult China into the future. Instead, it left behind a scar that would take generations to heal. But instead of stepping back, Mao doubled down and launched an even more radical campaign in the years that followed. Next up, the Cultural Revolution. If you thought the Great Leap Forward was turbulent, get ready, because next came the Cultural Revolution, a decade-long political earthquake that shook the very foundation of Chinese society. By the mid-1960s, Mao's prestige had taken a hit due to the catastrophic failures of the Great Leap Forward. But instead of retreating, Mao decided to reassert his dominance, not just politically, but ideologically. He wanted to reignite the revolutionary spirit, purge China of so-called capitalist elements, and purify the country's soul. Yes, you heard that right. This was less about economics and more about thought, belief, and loyalty. Let's start with ideological cleansing. This was no metaphor. Mao encouraged a witch hunt for anyone suspected of harboring bourgeois or capitalist leanings. Intellectuals, teachers, scientists, bureaucrats, no one was safe. These individuals were labeled enemies of the revolution simply for questioning party lines or engaging in critical thinking. Many were publicly humiliated, beaten, imprisoned, or even killed. Knowledge itself was treated with suspicion, and loyalty to Mao became the highest virtue. And who were the enforcers of this ideological crusade? Enter the Red Guards. Millions of young people, mostly high school and college students, were radicalized, armed with Mao's Little Red Book, and unleashed across the country. They disrupted schools, attacked officials, and stormed cultural institutions. These weren't just protests, they were mobs fueled by revolutionary zeal. Their mission was to dismantle the old world and create something new from its ashes, no matter the cost. But this movement didn't just target people, it tore through China's cultural fabric. That brings us to economic and cultural disruption. Schools were shut down, industries ground to a halt, and priceless historical artifacts, some thousands of years old, were destroyed in the name of progress. Temples were vandalized, ancient texts were burned, statues were smashed. In the rush to erase the past, a civilization's heritage was nearly lost. So what was the outcome? A fractured society, an entire generation lost to chaos, an economy paralyzed by fear and fanaticism, all in the pursuit of ideological purity. And who bore the brunt of all this upheaval? Rural communities. Let's turn to the next slide to explore the devastating impact this era had on China's countryside. Now let's zoom in on the countryside, the beating heart of Mao's revolution, and examine how all of this radical change played out on the ground. Spoiler alert, it wasn't pretty. Let's start with agricultural mismanagement. Remember those massive people's communes from the Great Leap Forward? Well, they were still around, and they were still inefficient. Decisions about planting, harvesting, and resource allocation weren't being made by farmers anymore, they were made by party officials, many of whom had zero farming experience. Crops were often planted in ways that ignored basic agricultural knowledge. People were told to plow deeper, plant closer, or try bizarre new techniques that sounded good in theory but failed in practice. The result? Declining yields, soil degradation, and a whole lot of wasted effort. Next, we have displacement and hardship. During the Cultural Revolution, millions of urban youth were sent to the countryside in what was called the Up to the Mountains, Down to the Countryside movement. The idea was that these students would learn from the peasants and develop a true revolutionary spirit. But in reality, they were often untrained, disillusioned, and resented by the rural communities they were supposed to help. Meanwhile, many local farmers found their traditional ways of life uprooted. They had to share land, homes, and food with these newcomers, even as their own livelihoods crumbled. And finally, there's long-term consequences. Mao's economic experiments left deep scars. Malnutrition stunted entire generations. Rural education systems were decimated. Infrastructure, things like roads, irrigation systems, and storage facilities, were neglected or destroyed. Trust in local governance was shattered, and economic productivity didn't just stall. In many places, it regressed. These weren't temporary setbacks. These were generational wounds that would take decades to heal, even after Mao was gone. So now that we've looked at how Mao's economic and ideological campaigns devastated rural China, let's take a step back and evaluate the legacy he left behind. Next up, an assessment of Mao's economic legacy, the good, the bad, and the irreversible. So, after all the sweeping campaigns, radical reforms, and ideological storms, what's the verdict? How do we make sense of Mao's economic legacy? Let's start with what some might consider the positive outcomes. And yes, despite the disasters, there were some undeniable achievements. For one, land reform. Before the communists took over, vast swaths of land were owned by a tiny group of landlords, while peasants worked like serfs. Mao's early land redistribution broke that system apart and gave land to millions of farmers, at least temporarily. It was a major shift in ownership that disrupted centuries of inequality. Then there were the improvements in literacy and health. The government launched massive campaigns to teach people to read, and they promoted basic sanitation and vaccination efforts that curbed diseases like smallpox and cholera. Life expectancy actually increased under Mao, which might surprise you considering the famines. And in rural areas, these improvements, modest as they were, marked a clear break from the past. But then we have to talk about the criticisms, and this is where the scale of failure becomes clear. Mao's policies were often ideologically driven, not economically rational. The obsession with political purity meant that expert advice was ignored, dissent was crushed, and bad ideas were implemented on a national scale without room for correction. The Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution were disasters of epic proportions, resulting in tens of millions of deaths, economic stagnation, and psychological trauma that still lingers today. Then there's the issue of legacy versus reform. After Mao's death in 1976, his successor, Deng Xiaoping, took over and basically reversed many of Mao's policies. He reintroduced market principles, welcomed foreign investment, and allowed private enterprise to grow. In other words, even the Communist Party realized that Mao's economic model was unsustainable. The reforms of the late 70s and 80s marked the beginning of China's modern economic rise, a rise built largely by abandoning the very policies Mao had championed. So, Mao's economic legacy is a paradox. On one hand, he unified a fractured country, sparked social reform, and attempted to address deep-rooted inequality. On the other, he imposed catastrophic policies that cost millions of lives and left the economy in shambles. It's a legacy that's both celebrated and condemned, often by the same people. Now, let's wrap it all up and talk about what we can learn from this era, and why it still matters today. Mao's economic vision was bold, idealistic, and deeply rooted in the belief that sheer willpower could reshape reality. But history shows us that when ideology overpowers evidence, and when central planning ignores local knowledge, the consequences can be catastrophic. China under Mao underwent massive transformation, not just in structure, but in spirit. Entire generations were shaped by collectivization, indoctrination, and campaigns that reached into every corner of daily life. And while there were genuine efforts to lift people out of poverty and eliminate inequality, the cost in human suffering was staggering. But perhaps the biggest takeaway is this: economic systems are more than just numbers and plans, they are about people. And when policies disregard the lived experiences of those on the ground, when they punish dissent and reward blind obedience, history tends to respond with tragedy. And yet, understanding Mao's economic legacy isn't just about assigning blame or praise, it's about recognizing how nations try to reinvent themselves, how power can be used to both inspire and destroy, and how deeply economic ideas can impact every aspect of life. If you found this deep dive into Mao's economic policies thought-provoking, you're going to love the other content we've got on this channel. At Truth Behind History, we take big historical topics and break them down in ways that are engaging, digestible, and sometimes even a little entertaining. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps us grow and reach more history lovers like you. And if you've got another historical era or figure you'd like us to explore, drop it in the comments. Don't forget to check out our other videos, whether it's revolutions, empires, or economic experiments. We're just getting started. Thanks for watching, and remember, history is never just about the past, it's the story of how we got here.